Hello, I am Blaze, and welcome back to Mastery Rank 0, a little show dedicated to trying to give some helpful advice to newer players. Today I will be covering a selection of melee weapons available early on. Melee weapons use special stance mods which gives you different movesets for compatible weapons, as well as providing some extremely useful added mod capacity. However, some of these stances may not be easy to get, so for the most part you'll be choosing a melee weapon early on for its quick melee rather than its own dedicated moveset. That said, I will also cover some weapons with more easily accessible stances as well. Melee weapons have the early advantage of a much lower barrier to entry compared to primary and secondary weapons. Pressure Point, the base damage mod, is a common mod which makes it easier both to find and rank up. This is also true for True Steel for critical chance and Organ Shatter for critical damage. So as a result, it's not hard to imagine that melee weapons may very well end up being your go-to option for high damage early on. With that in mind, I feel more comfortable with putting all three mods on the weapon for testing purposes, though I will leave them at rank 4. This should be reasonably obtainable given the common mod's lowered fusion power requirement, and will still be a pretty rough scenario as you will likely have access to some elemental damage mods as well by the time you're on Jupiter or Saturn. One final thing to note is that this list isn't entirely exhaustive, but it will cover what I personally feel are the better choices with a minimal barrier to entry. There are some other early-ish melee weapons that you can pick up, but they can require fairly rare or hard to acquire resources, like the Cronin requiring 2 Argon crystals. If you happen to see anything you would like to try out, then go for it. This list is more of a guide than any kind of hardline do this sort of thing anyway. With those things in mind, let's get going. I'll begin with stuff you can start working towards right away at Mastery Rank 0, when you're literally just finished 4's prize. Starting things off, we have the fairly unique Obex and Kogake, both of which are currently the only sparring weapon type in Warframe, and both available immediately at Mastery Rank 0. They differ from each other slightly, with the Kogake having more base damage and the Obex being faster with a slightly higher critical chance, and having a wider electrical elements ground slam attack. Both are actually quite good, though personally I feel their default polarized stance, Brutal Tide, while cool looking, is extremely slow and clunky to work with. Grim Fury is faster and more easily found, but does not match the default polarities, which is mildly infuriating, and it happens to make for a dull moveset. The Obex and Kogake's main selling point is arguably their slide attacks. While somewhat difficult to land consistently, they are a handspring kick that basically send enemies into fucking orbit. I'm serious, it's amazing. And if slide attacks aren't your thing, you can just use them to reenact Fist of the North Star with their quick melee attacks. Sparring weapons also have the distinction of having a fairly useful charge attack. While equipped, if you hold down the attack button, provided it doesn't conflict with a stance combo, your Tenno will charge up with an axe kick. When you land this in close proximity to an enemy, it'll actually pull them into a finisher attack. Not a bad option if there's something you're having trouble killing. Both have similar crafting requirements, though the Obex is a bit cheaper. The Obex's blueprint costs 15,000 credits, and the crafting materials are 30,000 credits, 650 circuits, 900 salvage, 700 ferrite, and 300 alloy plates. The Kogake's credit costs are the same, but instead requires 400 rubido, 3 morphics, 1,200 ferrite, and 500 alloy plates. Moving along to a very nice early staff weapon, the Amphis is a straightforward but effective choice, boasting a reasonably high base damage, high attack rate, and an electrical slam attack that provides some spot crowd control if you'd like to get enemies to stop what they're doing. Sadly, staff stances can be difficult to find for a new player as they drop from enemies in the void. But of the two, Clashing Forest is the more all-around useful one with a simple hold forward combo that rapidly spins the staff in front of your Tenno for multiple hits. A good way to tear through something quickly. Its 2 pause 3 combo, Battering Roots, also has a great deal of forward travel and looks pretty cool to boot. The Amphis blueprint is available in the market for 15,000 credits, and the foundry crafting requirements are 30,000 credits, 2 neurodes, 500 salvage, 600 circuits, and 600 alloy plates. For the Tenno that prefers a blade by their side, meanwhile, good early options for immediate acquisition are the Heat and Ether swords. They're largely a slight variation on each other, with the Ether Sword being faster and the Heat Sword having a higher base damage per hit and an elevated 20% status chance. The Heat Sword specifically also has a 5 meter fiery shockwave for slam attacks, which is itself quite useful. Though on the other hand, the Ether Sword looks fucking amazing, and its own slam attack, while shorter ranged, is a guaranteed radiation status effect that can cause enemies to fight amongst themselves instead of you. Though radiation friendly fire isn't 100% reliable, it is nonetheless useful. I will also briefly mention single sword stances. They include Iron Phoenix, which is bad and difficult to get, Crimson Dervish, which is very good and 2 steps away from impossible to get, and Vengeful Revenant, which is also very good and 1 step away from impossible to get. So in all likelihood, you're not going to get a stance for this weapon class in any reasonable time frame. This makes the swords, at least early on, more of a dedicated quick melee option. The Heat Sword's blueprint can either be acquired from specific alert mission rewards or more conveniently from completing the Once Awake quest, which will be immediately available to you after Vor's prize. The Heat Sword's crafting requirements will run you 20,000 credits, 1 neural sensor, 500 ferrite, 300 circuits, and 300 polymer bundles. The inclusion of the neural sensor means you will need to at least reach Jupiter before you can craft it. The Ether Sword's blueprint, meanwhile, can be bought as normal from the market for 20,000 credits, and the foundry crafting afterwards will need a further 20,000 credits, as well as 4 Morphics, 700 Rubido, 900 Ferrite, and 700 alloy plates. As for Tenno who prefer 2 blades by their side instead, the Heat and Ether Swords also have dual-wield variations. They share a similar trade-off again, with the dual Ether being slightly faster and the dual Heat Swords being slightly stronger. But this time the dual Ether loses its radiation status effect slam attack, while the dual Heat Swords keep their fiery slam, which is moderately annoying. I'm not sure why the dual Ethers don't have their radiation, but there you go. Unlike single swords for new players though, it is worth paying attention to the stances this time. Swirling Tiger, while basic, is a pretty reasonable stance with plenty of multi-hit combos that you may be able to get early on, and matches the polarity of the dual Ethers. The dual Heat Swords have no default stance polarity meanwhile. This does mean that it can use either Swirling Tiger or Crossing Snakes fine, but it won't get the doubled capacity increase bonus if it did match something. Speaking of Crossing Snakes, that dual sword stance is both much more difficult to find as well as being clunky and slow. So personally I'd consider Crossing Snakes not even worth considering. So with this in mind, you may elect to side with the dual Ethers just for the access to the matching stance without having to add a forma. Though the dual Heat Swords retain their fiery crowd control slam attack, so the choice falls to you. This time, both blueprints are available in the market. The dual Heat Swords blueprint will cost 15,000 credits, and the foundry crafting will require another 20,000 credits, as well as 2 Morphics, 900 salvage, 1000 ferrite, and 700 polymer bundles. In the other corner, the dual Ether Swords blueprint costs 15,000 credits instead, with the crafting requirements being another 20,000 credits, as well as 3 Morphics, 900 salvage, 850 ferrite, and 800 polymer bundles. Mastery rank 1 specific melee weapons are all pretty lackluster actually, so let's just skip forward to Mastery rank 2 options. The Dual Zoran are actually a very old weapon, and yet they remain highly regarded and competitive to this day. These will be your earliest critical hit focused dual swords. Yes, I know they're clearly axes, but the game classifies them as dual sword type weapons. Featuring a respectable base damage, blistering 1.17 attack speed modifier, and a 25% critical chance with a 3 times critical damage multiplier, these things can probably just stay with you forever if you really want. However, it does come with the annoyance of having a D polarity by default, which on most weapons is more of a hindrance than anything else. But I suppose early on you can just throw your ice damage mod in there for extra damage. The Dual Zoran blueprint is available from the market for 15,000 credits, and the foundry building afterwards will need a further 30,000 credits, as well as 4 Morphics, 900 salvage, 1,100 ferrite, and 800 alloy plates. Relatively expensive, but technically still available on your first set of planets. The Orthos will likely be your first polearm type weapon, and it's basically a double-sided halberd. Sadly, pole weapon stances both suck, but you can probably find Shimmering Blight, in my opinion the better of the two, somewhere along the way. The Orthos is slightly on the slower side, but it does feature a long reach thanks to its construction and a reasonably high base damage. But its real standout feature on this list is its slam attack. The radius on it is insane. Like, check this out, you're basically knocking things over from across the room. So you can go in there and perform a ground finisher or just give yourself some breathing room. The knockdown seems to happen regardless, but the Orthos slam attacks feature a blast type damage, which, while not fantastic, is a fairly neutral damage type. The Orthos blueprint can be bought from the market for 20,000 credits, and the foundry crafting afterwards will require a further 20,000 credits, 4 morphics, 500 polymer bundles, 850 ferrite, and 700 alloy plates. And now we step up to Mastery Rank 3 choices. I will temper my following statement with the fact that the Orthos and Dual Zoran are both very good weapons. Mastery Rank 3 is where you start getting access to the big boys. The Aether Reaper will likely be the first scythe type weapon you can get. A weapon class that has been buffed across the board a while ago and are no longer awful. The Aether Reaper shares its cool aesthetic with the earlier Aether swords, and features high damage, a reasonable capacity for critical hits, decent status chance, and is also reasonably fast. Also, it's the least ridiculous looking of the scythes in this game, being essentially an overly long axe blade. But people are fascinated with fucking scythes in video games for some reason. Which of the two stances, Reaping Spiral or Stalking Fan, you use will likely be up to personal preference. Reaping Spiral is likely to be the one you will find first, being uncommon, and due to the enemies that drop it, this may very well be one of the first stances you find, but the Aether Reaper's stance slot sadly matches Stalking Fan and not Reaping Spiral, but adding it on anyway is still a good idea. Reaping Spiral focuses more on speed and multi-hit combos, while Stalking Fan is significantly slower, but it hits a wider area with more powerful strikes. The Aether Reaper's blueprint is rather expensive at 50,000 credits, with the foundry crafting require a further 15,000 credits, 1,000 polymer bundles, 1,000 rubido, 10 morphics, and 1,000 ferrite. But if scythes are your thing, then the Aether Reaper is a solid enough choice, especially early game. And now I'll wrap this little list up with quite possibly the most awesome melee weapon in the game, or at least in the top 2. Say hello to the Galatine, a giant fucking sword. It's a little on the slow side without a Fury mod, though still actually the fastest of the heavy blade weapons, but features an extremely high base damage and high status chance. Its critical chance, while a bit low, is workable as well. Additionally, it comes along with a dash polarity by default, which is a great boon, and also has a stance polarity which matches the Cleaving Whirlwind stance, best known for its Broken Bowl combo. Or should I say, spin around like a giant death blender and kill everything combo. The other stance combos are actually good too, but let's be honest, you're probably going to be spinning around all the time if and when you can find Cleaving Whirlwind. However, even without a stance, its high damage and long reach will be able to stay with you forever. And even without the stance, you will probably find it fun to repeatedly dunk on everything with its slam attack. It's definitely what I did. Seriously, the Galatine is still useful even right at the end. So this is a very solid long-term investment for the freshly Mastery Rank 3 Tenno. The Galatine's blueprint can be bought from the market for 25,000 credits, and the foundry crafting afterwards will run you a further 30,000 credits, as well as 4 gallium, 750 salvage, 500 rubido, and 200 alloy plates. For a sword this awesome, a comparatively minor price. This concludes my main picks for early melee weapons in Warframe, and should hopefully serve as a useful set of pointers to pick out some melee weapons that you will both enjoy and be able to use effectively when you're starting out with a whole solar system in front of you and not a whole lot of direction. Of course, for all other things not covered in this video, there's always the wiki, which I definitely recommend consulting because Warframe has a lot to it that it doesn't really explain very well. Thank you for watching the melee weapon edition of Mastery Rank 0. All comments are appreciated and I hope to see you around next time. For recommendations on primary or secondary weapons for new players, you can go check those editions of Mastery Rank 0, or for my other content you can check out my overview and rant for Worm Prime. And as always, good luck, have fun, and take care.